Hello and welcome to another edition of Legislative Update here on Okemo Valley TV. My name is Tom Ayres, senior staff writer with the Vermont Standard newspaper in Woodstock, and this program is produced in collaboration with Okemo Valley TV. Each week we have featured State Representative Tesha Buss, representing Woodstock, Plymouth, and Reading, and the legislature has ended for this session. The 2024 session concluded at 2 a.m. on Saturday morning in Montpelier. And Representative Buss is here today to talk with us about three major pieces of legislation and action that were taken by the legislature this session, kind of the big three. Welcome, Tesha. Good to see you again.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
So the three topics we're going to address today that the legislature dealt with this session are data security, Act 250, and the state education yield. Let's start with the data security legislation. Can you give us an overview of that and what it entails?
Yeah, so these were two different bills that went through. One is basically called the Vermont Kids Code, and that is really important because the way that everyone receives our data today, we want to ensure that kids are far more protected than even we adults are. But it's also about how apps are designed to rope kids in and to get them addicted.
Mm-hmm.
There were a couple of reps that spoke on the floor about their children having these apps. There's one in the education community, which was started, under the good faith, or that's how they marketed it, that, you can be working on some sort of science project, and then, you have a kid in North Carolina that's working on the same science project, and that you can join this network and chit chat back and forth, but it's completely anonymous. And therein lies the issue. It's completely anonymous. So kids were getting bullied. Parents were helping their children to flag it, but because it was anonymous, there was never any ability to make a bad situation right. There was never any apology. And you all know that when you're anonymous, you have free reign to say things that you would never say because there's no ability to get caught. And so there was a school up north in Vermont. They joined this platform, and the principal said that he has never seen this amount of harm ever, let alone in the fact that they only had it active for 24 hours.
Oh my goodness.
So
may I ask what the name of the app is?
Well, there's many, but there was one called Yik Yak.
Yik Yak?
Yik Yak. So that is the point of the legislation, is to make sure that app developers in the state of Vermont are not going to be allowed to use certain types of practices in creating apps that will be addictive to kids and will cause a lot of psychological harm. Then the other part of data privacy has to do with, every time you log into a website and you accept all the cookies, they get to know so much information about you. And then they also sell that information. And so the most important part of this is that you will have to go through opt-outs. So, sometimes opt in and sometimes opt out. It's an incredibly dense piece of legislation that I can't speak to with the level of fidelity that I think some people would want me to go down. But what I can say is that if you are a Vermonter and you do not want them to take your data down, there will be opt-ins and opt-outs that you will be able to click on to make sure that that if you don't want your data to be sold to that company, or that company to collect it first, that you will have that right. And then the private right of action, man, when you have national lobby descending upon the state of Vermont, that you've touched a really intense source. And one of the reasons why that lobby is pretty big is because there's a lot of money in selling your data. And that's what they're trying to protect. They're trying to protect their ability to sell data. I mean, since becoming a state representative, I am on so many email lists of legislators all over the country. I don't know who the heck they are. And I don't want to know. Sometimes I'm glad that their race is going great in North Carolina, but I don't live there. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
know
I
that our
hear
data
you.
is being sold constantly. So this is the private right of action means that you can have a bunch of consumers come together to make a class action lawsuit against people collecting and selling our data in a way that we do not authorize them to do. Basically, it's like if you, as long as you are transparent about the fact that you're giving the information to the Vermont Country Store or to Orvis or wherever it is that you're going to shop online, that's fine. You can absolutely still do that and get all the coupons for all the shoes and everything that it is that you want to buy.
Yeah.
But if they've done something wrong with it, there can be a class action. So this legislation is really important. And we have an amazing representative from Bradford named Monique Priestley, who can speak in a way that's really pretty profound and impressive. And if it weren't for her, we would not have passed this bill. As to whether or not Governor Scott will veto it, that I have no idea on
He
with
has
this.
expressed some concern, I believe.
Yes, because business is really important, and we don't want to hurt our Vermont businesses, that's for sure. But there's also, when you really get down into the legislation really, really deeply, it shouldn't hurt them. Not from what I see, and not from the distilling down of all the testimony that I have heard. So.
And just to be clear, the same legislation deals with both the manipulative apps and
There were
two separate pieces
Well,
of legislation.
it looked as if for a period of time that they were going to combine them, maybe in hopes that that would make it veto proof, not for sure. But I think in the end, if I am remembering correctly, because this came through at 11:30 at night, they kept them separately. Like 99% sure I'm right.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
let's talk then about an annual topic for the legislature and an annual topic for legislative update and a regular topic for the Vermont Standard Act 250 and Act 250 reform. What has come out of this 2024 session in terms of changes to Act 250?
Yes. So a professionalized board is going to be created. They call it the Land Use Review Board, or LURB. This board will be able to, this board is really important. There's actually nobody on either side that disagrees that this board needs to become professionalized so that there can be oversight to the 9 commissions and their district coordinators. And that's going to be incredibly helpful. It should unify how decisions are made throughout the state so that hopefully we don't have businesses in one corner of the state that go through Act 250 and then a business in a different part of the state that is being held up for basically when it seems as if it's the same style and type of business. So that equity and that management is going to be extremely important. Some of the sticking points were the appeals. So we are going to keep appeals with the courts, but we're going to study it to see if in the future, as the Land Use Review Board switches and takes more agency, that maybe in the future that would make sense. But they also have to find out how the 2 different parts of what permits can go through and figure out how to consolidate them. That's the big issue. Because if your septic permit gets contested, then that would go through the environmental court. And if the Land Review Board, the LURB, did your overall Act 250 and the 2 got to the Supreme Court, there isn't a way to reconcile which one should be right and which one shouldn't be right. So that's what they really have to study, is to make sure that that they can consolidate. I believe there's 2 different terms, and I believe it's consolidate is the one that we're looking for, that they'll be truly understanding whether or not the land use review board can do that in the future, and we can switch how we handle all the permits. And to be honest with you, there's a lot of trust building that needs to happen. We need to ensure that the land use review board is really going to not be overly sympathetic to the environment and underrepresentative of business interests and the economic interest of the state. So we really have to see that is working efficiently and well. And then once that is the case and they have established trust, then I think a lot of people would be feeling a bit better about appeals being handled by them, but that is going to be down the road. We talked a lot about the tiers. So, we have a bunch of tier 1A towns. You think, Burlington, Brattleboro, our bigger metropolises, they're going to be handling all Act 250 permits, excuse me, at the town level. Tier 1B is something like Woodstock, Vermont, where we're going to have to, we're going to be opting into certain things and we have to prove certain things. So we will have to beef up our bylaws in certain areas to make sure that we have the environmental protections that Act 250 wants the town to have when handling the permits. Public engagement has been a piece that we really fought for a lot. And then our tier 2 and tier 3 jurisdictions. This is where I think the governor is going to have the biggest issue with the Act 250 bill. Because you first start with tier 3, these are critical natural resources of statewide significance. These are places where you're talking wetlands, headwaters, and river corridors where it's almost going to be immediate that Act 250 has jurisdiction, that there will be a trigger. And then tier 2 is the landscape of anything in between downtown Woodstock, basically, and a critical natural resource of statewide significance. And right now, that's very ambiguous. That's basically the majority of Vermont. And there's a road rule that would trigger in tier 2, whether or not you would go under Act 250's jurisdiction. But there's a lot of that's where the governor's going to have the most issue with that. And it's the least clear of all the tiers. It's easy to say, here's where we can let go of jurisdiction and exempt properties and let business and let housing get rooted in our downtowns. That makes sense. And it makes sense that we're going to protect those critical natural resources, but we don't have a map that shows us what percentage tier 3 is and what tier 1 and B is, 1A and 1B. And so he might have issues with like the cart before the horse. Maybe we should see the whole maps first. But who knows? He really, the administration was very, very active in these negotiations in the last minute. And that's basically the only reason why I think the Senate and the House started meeting more eye to eye.
I'd like to explore the LURB a little bit more. When we talked about this issue previously, I had the impression that the LURB and the Natural Resources Board were going to be one and the same entity.
That is true.
That is true. But
yes.
Okay.
Well, sort of. No, I shouldn't say that. There is the LURB will be made up of 5 full-time people. It got switched from 1 full-time and 4 part-time to 5 full-times to get this going. And there's definitely still administration that will be a part of the natural resources, the Agency of Natural Resources and the Natural Resources Board, because there are many, many employees that are not going to be in this land use review board.
Will the LURB operate under the Agency of Natural Resources, or will it be a separate entity? Is that
It's
not
like
clear?
it's a separate entity. I mean, you're talking about a 143-page bill here, so might have that detail wrong. I mean, it certainly is an independent quasi-judicial body.
Okay, excellent.
That is for sure.
Yeah. is one of the concerns that people had voiced to me, and I think we even addressed this a little bit when we talked about this issue previously, is the appeal process going through the LURB is sort of like, I think the analogy I drew was the fox guarding the hen house, in a sense, because having an appeal of a decision adjudicated quasi-judicially by the same body that made the decision seems kind of
Yes,
counterintuitive.
I gave a pretty strong speech on the floor of the House about that very thing.
Mhm.
And you know, it's like you said, that is very, very important that there is a that someone is hearing all of the information that has not been a part of the formulation of that at
Mhm.
all. And I also believe that the professionalization of that board should reduce appeals. Right now, the
Mhm.
appeals are just loaded, and it's loaded because we've got commissions and district coordinators that are not always in alignment. They're not. I think a lot of people would say some decisions have not been reasonable.
Mhm. Mhm.
And
Absolutely.
you know, our courts are loaded with a lot of that. And so if we can reduce that, then maybe having the appeal stay with the courts won't be as big of a deal because they won't be overloaded.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So,
and one of the other issues that I've written extensively about for the standard that I hopefully will be addressed by this formation of the LURB, and you touched on it earlier, is the inconsistency and the incongruities between this case in one part of the state, in one district, is dealt with this way, and it's granted a permit, and in another district, exactly the same type of permit application is denied. Um, and so hopefully with this professional oversight of 5 full-time employees over the district commissions and the district commission coordinators, there'll be much more uniformity in the application of the regulation. So, well, excellent. Let's then talk about the third and final major piece of legislative action that came out of this session, and that's the annual setting of the educational yield. If you could explain what the yield is as succinctly as you can, and it's a very complicated process, that would be helpful. And then what happened with that this session?
okay, I will do my best. So we're going to level set here. Every school district in the state of Vermont passes a school budget. We tally up the total of all those budgets, and then it's the legislature's job when we set the yield. The yield is the amount of money that we have to raise that satisfies the financial amount of the total of all school budgets throughout the state. We are not just deciding we want to spend a bunch of money. We are raising the amount of money that the totality of all the school budgets have told us that they need. So how do we raise all this money? We raise this money through property taxes. There is this year we did an average rate, which would allow towns across the state to experience a more level tax rate, meaning you might be in a town where your common level of appraisal just shot right up. The market was super hot in your area due to COVID, and you might be a town that experienced hardly any real estate turnover in COVID. And so that average kind of helped the entire state level out a little bit and have not some areas be so hard hit by their common level of appraisal to create this tax rate. So we use property taxes, homestead and non-homestead. Non-homestead includes everything that isn't a year-round residency, businesses, nonprofits, etc., second homes. I'm going to remind everybody that next year, the legislature will be able to look at separating out categories of the non-homestead tax rate. That can't happen until The Vermont Department of Taxes comes back in January of 2025.
Mhm.
And we use sales and use tax. We use meals and rooms tax, and some other much, much smaller taxes.
Mhm.
So we take the amount of money from all of those taxes, and then we have to see what the tax rate is. Now, we got to that point, and everybody's property taxes were going to increase by this 19%. So we were like, how can we add more sources of revenue into the education fund? So we repealed the cloud tax. So that'll provide about $25 million in revenue. We transferred 25 million out of the general fund, which is also one-time money. We put in a short-term rental tax rate.
Mm.
The House had put in 1.5% on top of the meals and rooms tax, which is already 9%. And the Senate raised that up to 3%. So short-term rentals are really, really taking a real strong hit
Mhm.
in the state. Now, granted, it is your renter that pays that. It's not the property owner of that short-term rental. But of course, it adds to what the person is paying for the rental, which means it's going to really probably keep down the rates that people will be able to use to.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely.
And we hope that our cleaning crews out there don't get hit, and that
Mhm.
those fees start to get reduced so that the owner can retain as much income as before. Hopefully,
Mhm.
all of that will work
Mhm.
together. And then, did I get all the sources of revenue into?
Let me ask this, what will, I mean, you've cited sources of revenue, kind of an overview of what the statewide impact is going to be. Do you have a sense of what the impact is going to be specifically on the towns and the school districts within your area of representation, let's say within the Mountain View School District, where we've got another bond issue coming up for a vote sometime in the next couple of months. Not that that's directly related to the yield, but still, education costs are top the taxpayer agenda these days. And I'm wondering what the impact of this year's yield legislation will be specifically on our local communities. Do you
Yeah.
have a sense of that?
Well, we Commissioner Bolio's letter said 19% would be the rate increase for our property taxes.
Mm-hmm.
We were only able to whittle that down to 14%. So 14% will be the increase. And then whatever, if we decided to vote on the bond would be on top of that. Now, we did pass the school construction task force bill, the working group, excuse me. It's going to be a small group of legislators that are going to work over the summer to basically write that legislation in advance so that we're not writing that in the process of the legislative session. We're going to come with something a little bit more baked in to just, we'll get just enough testimony to confirm all the pieces, so that we can really move forward with the state construction aid project, or, product. And that's going to be determining a revenue source and then looking at a really sustainable way to fund education, which is probably going to be able to fund 30% or some sort of percentage of your annual bond payment. It's not going to be a one-time upfront payment. But the state still has to protect that. We still have to make sure that our bonding capacity can hold our annual payment for the entirety of that bond.
Mm-hmm.
So it
Mm-hmm.
is still going to affect our bond rating, but
Mm-hmm.
it is better because it is funded by taxpayers paying on the local level. So there is the bond rating is helped because of that. It's
Mm-hmm.
not taxpayers paying then directly. The state has a capture in
Mm-hmm.
there. of its
Okay.
interests first before the school
Sure.
gets the money. So that does help the rating considerably. But yeah, there's still going to need to be an income for it.
Mhm.
What I have distilled down from this legislative session is in a 2 to 3% range, we need to increase population and housing uh, and our in our business community. We need
Mhm.
a bit more flow. Do we need
Mhm.
to like turn on the spigot full bore? No, we don't even have space and regulatory options for a fire hose to go on right now. We're talking about a nice steady garden hose sprinkling the lawn.
Uh-huh.
Um, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because we need year-round residents here and their income tax and their property tax to really start to slowly work down the fact that we just don't have enough people here
Mhm. Mhm.
making the revenues that we need to make to hold up a really small state.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That caps the discussion of the educational yield and the tax situation off very nicely. Appreciate that. Any likelihood that the governor will have issues with the education funding bill? Has he weighed in on that at all?
I think he probably is going to have some issues with it. It's really hard. We've had blue ribbon tax commissions. Sometimes the legislature listens to them, sometimes they don't. The in the yield bill is a commission that is put together to specifically look at the totality of the education system, including its finances, um, and then making recommendations with the Agency of Human Services so that we can grapple with mental health.
Mhm.
We're leaving too many federal dollars on the table. We absolutely need to get more of what we call designated agencies into our schools, taking care of mental health so that teachers can focus on teaching. We passed a great literacy bill that will get our teachers to work on teaching the science of reading, which has accelerated the reading of kids in our local school that were struggling during COVID. But they weren't just struggling during COVID, they were struggling from using an old method of teaching reading that wasn't science and evidence-based. Once those kids got that evidence base, they just started like just skyrocketing in their reading. So that's going to help because if we have kids that are in group intervention instead of one-on-one intervention, less expensive. We are looking at reference-based pricing for healthcare. That's going to be something this commission encourages, all the powers that be to continue with that and prescription drug coverage. So, it's sort of like looking at the entirety of the state when we look at
Mhm.
what education is these days. And we've
Yeah.
just been dumping, just put it in the ed fund. We'll just raise it on property taxes. And I think that we piled it on a little bit too much in one category. And even though we still have to raise that revenue overall, it's not
Mhm.
always just on the backs of your property. That's where we need to sort of ease out
Mhm. Mhm.
ease out the burden a little bit more.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate the thoroughness with which you've addressed these three issues. Deeply appreciative of your service and of the service of all your fellow legislators. Unless there is a veto session and we come back for another edition of legislative update for that purpose, this will probably be our final edition of legislative update for this session, which concluded at 2 a.m. Saturday morning this past week. And Tasha, it's been a pleasure working with you throughout this legislative session. Perhaps we'll see you again for a veto program, but if not, wish you all the best and look forward to reconvening legislative update next January.
Thanks so much, Tom. I really appreciate it.